November 2nd, 1698. 5 ships carrying 1,200 Scottish settlers drop anchor off the coast of Panama. They plant their flag in the sand. They open crates filled with woolen blankets and thousands of combs. They believe they are founding an empire. They are actually attending their own funeral. History tells us Scotland lost its independence because England was stronger. That's a lie. Scotland didn't lose a war. Scotland went bankrupt. And the receipt for that bankruptcy was the Treaty of Union. This is the story of how a nation bet everything on a single investment and lost. This is the story of how the ledger, not the sword, killed the kingdom. In the year 1690, Scotland was an ancient nation. It had survived centuries of English invasions. It had produced warriors like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. The Highlands were filled with proud clans. Edinburgh was a city of stone and ceremony. On paper, Scotland looked like a sovereign state. But sovereignty is not measured in castles or in bagpipes. It is measured in gold, and Scotland was bleeding gold. The nation's economy was agricultural. 90% of the population lived on the land. They grew oats and barley. They raised cattle and sheep, but the soil was poor. The climate was brutal. There was no surplus. There was no way to generate wealth beyond subsistence. Scotland had no colonies. It had no navy worth mentioning. It had no access to the new economy of the world. The great trade routes of the 17th century ran through London, Amsterdam, and Lisbon. Scotland was locked out. Here's the trap. England controlled Scotland's access to global markets through a piece of legislation called the Navigation Acts. These laws stated that only English ships could trade with English colonies. Scottish merchants could not sell linen in Virginia. They could not buy sugar in Jamaica. They were economically blockaded by their own neighbor. Scotland was a nation with ambition but no cash flow. It was a business model designed to fail. And then the climate struck the final blow. In 1695, the weather in Europe shifted. The winters became longer and colder. The summers were wet and gray. For 7 consecutive years, the harvests failed across Scotland. They call this period the 7 ill years. It was a famine of biblical proportions. In the countryside, entire villages disappeared. People dropped dead in the streets of Edinburgh with grass in their mouths. They had tried to graze like animals just to fill their stomachs. Historians estimate that up to 15% of Scotland's population died or fled during this period. Think about that scale. 1 in every 7 people. Gone. The Scottish economy collapsed into medieval chaos. There was no food to eat. There was no surplus to sell. The treasury was empty. The government could barely pay its soldiers. Scotland was not just poor. It was on the edge of extinction as a functioning state. And into this atmosphere of desperation walked a man named William Paterson. He was a Scot, but he had made his fortune in London. He was a financier and a dreamer. He had helped found the Bank of England in 1694. He understood the new economy better than almost anyone alive, and he had a pitch that would change history. Paterson returned to Edinburgh with a map and a promise. He pointed to a narrow strip of land in Central America, the Isthmus of Darien. We know it today as Panama. Paterson called it the door of the seas and the key to the universe. His pitch was intoxicating. If Scotland could establish a colony there, they could build a port on the Atlantic and a port on the Pacific. They could transport goods across the narrow land bridge in a matter of days. They could cut out the long, dangerous voyage around the southern tip of South America. Whoever controlled this choke point, Paterson argued, would control the trade between East and West. They would hold the keys to China and the Indies. The merchants of the world would have to pay a toll to Scotland. It would make Scotland the richest nation on earth. Paterson described Darien as a tropical Eden. He claimed the soil was so fertile it yielded 3 harvests a year without effort. He said the hills were full of gold. He said the natives were friendly and eager to trade. He painted a picture of paradise, and he made one crucial claim. He said no European power controlled this land. It was free for the taking. This was a lie. Spain considered all of Central America to be its sovereign territory, but nobody in Edinburgh checked the facts. They were too desperate for hope. The Scottish Parliament was mesmerized. In 1695 they passed an act establishing the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies. It was modeled on the English East India Company. It was given sweeping powers. It could raise armies, build forts, sign treaties, and operate tax-free for 20 years. It was a sovereign corporation. Now came the hard part, raising the capital. Paterson calculated he needed £400,000 sterling. In the 1690s, this was an astronomical sum. It was roughly half of Scotland's total money supply. At first, Paterson tried to raise funds in London. English investors were enthusiastic, but the English government stepped in. The powerful East India Company feared competition. King William III, who ruled both England and Scotland, ordered the English investors to withdraw. He didn't want his Scottish subjects provoking Spain. The English investors pulled out. Scotland was on its own. This rejection transformed the Darien Scheme from a business venture into a national crusade. It became a matter of pride. The Scots were furious. They believed England was trying to keep them poor. A wave of nationalist fervor swept the country. The subscription books opened in Edinburgh in February 1696. The response was hysterical. Every layer of Scottish society emptied their pockets. Dukes and earls mortgaged their estates to buy shares worth thousands of pounds. Merchants liquidated their inventory. Lawyers, doctors, professors, and priests bought in. Shopkeepers scraped together their life savings. Widows handed over their pensions. Even servants pooled their wages to buy fractions of shares. It was a financial mania. People weren't buying stock. They were buying salvation. By the time the books closed, Scotland had raised £400,000. It was roughly 40% of all the liquid capital in the entire kingdom. Think about that. Almost half of the nation's money was now sitting in the accounts of a single company betting on a jungle in Panama. With the capital secured, the company began preparations. They bought ships from Amsterdam and Hamburg because Scotland didn't have shipyards capable of building ocean-going vessels. They recruited 1,200 settlers. They were the cream of Scottish society, officers, ministers, doctors, and sons of the gentry, ordinary men and women hoping for a new life. They were all promised land and freedom in the New World, but there was a fatal flaw. The Scots had to bring trade goods to sell to the indigenous people and passing ships. So what did they pack? They'd packed what they knew. They loaded the ships with thousands of heavy woolen blankets and coats, perfect for a Scottish winter, useless in a tropical jungle. They packed thousands of pairs of heavy leather shoes. They'd packed wigs and Bibles. and most famously they packed over 4,000 combs. They assumed the natives of Panama would be desperate for Scottish grooming products. They packed almost no food seeds suitable for the tropics. They packed very few tools for clearing dense jungle. On July 12, 1698, the fleet assembled at the port of Leith. The entire city of Edinburgh turned out to watch. It was a festival. People cheered and wept. Ministers blessed the ships. They called the settlers the Argonauts of the North. As the ships raised their anchors and sailed into the North Sea, nobody on the docks knew they were watching a slow-motion execution. The voyage was brutal. The Scots were not experienced ocean sailors. The ships were overcrowded and poorly ventilated. Food rotted in the barrels. Water turned green with algae. Dysentery and fever broke out below decks. By the time the fleet reached the Caribbean, 40 people had already died. But the survivors remained optimistic. They believed the hard part was over. On November 2, 1698, the lookout spotted land, the coast of Darien. The ships navigated into a natural harbor that Paterson named Caledonia Bay. The settlers rowed ashore. They planted the Scottish flag. They claimed the land for the company and the king. They began to unload the wool, the combs, and the Bibles. They started digging foundations for their capital, New Edinburgh. In their letters home, written in those first few weeks, they described the land as beautiful and promising. They sent these letters back on passing ships. The letters took months to arrive. By the time the Scottish public was reading these glowing reports and celebrating the success of the colony, the reality on the ground had turned into hell. The harbor was not deep. It was treacherous and shallow, guarded by submerged rocks. To get the heavy crates ashore, the men had to stand waist-deep in the surf for hours under the equatorial sun. The site chosen for New Edinburgh was even worse. It was a narrow spit of land surrounded by stagnant water. It was a mosquito breeding ground, but the Scots were stubborn. They felled trees and built huts. They dragged cannons up muddy slopes. They began to plant the few seeds that hadn't rotted. For the first few weeks, adrenaline kept them going, but an economy cannot run on adrenaline. It needs a market, and this was the first catastrophic failure. The settlers opened their crates to trade with the local Kuna people. The Kuna were friendly and curious. The Scots proudly displayed their wares: heavy woolen blankets, thick stockings, leather shoes, and combs. The Kuna looked at these heavy, itchy fabrics in the stifling heat. They were baffled. They had no use for wool. They didn't wear heavy shoes. The Scots tried to explain the value, but economics is universal. There was zero demand. The trade mission stalled on day one. Then came the second blow, economic warfare. King William III was furious about the Darien Scheme. He saw it as a threat to his relationship with Spain. He issued a royal proclamation to all English governors in the Caribbean and North America. It was brutal. No English subject was allowed to offer any assistance to the Scots at Darien. They were forbidden to sell them food, forbidden to lend them money, forbidden to buy their goods. The colony was placed under total economic blockade by its own king. Ships from Jamaica passed within sight of New Edinburgh. They refused to stop. The Scots watched from the beach as their lifeline sailed past. They were isolated. They had money. The company had sent chests of silver. But money is useless if no one will sell you anything. They were the richest people in the jungle, and they were starving. By early 1699, the rainy season began. It didn't just rain. The sky opened and drowned the colony. The huts leaked constantly. The ground turned into a slurry of mud and excrement. The provisions from Scotland began to rot. The bread turned green. The meat crawled with maggots. And then the flux arrived. Dysentery and yellow fever swept through New Edinburgh like wildfire. The mosquito-infested swamp was a biological weapon. Men would wake up with a fever and be dead by sunset. The doctors had no effective medicine. They bled the patients, which only killed them faster. At the height of the epidemic, 12 settlers were dying every single day. The living were too weak to bury the dead. They dug shallow mass graves. The rains washed the soil away, exposing the bodies. The stench of death hung over the colony. William Paterson watched his dream collapse. His own wife died. He fell ill himself, drifting in and out of consciousness. Discipline broke down. The 4 counselors appointed to lead argued constantly. One was a Spanish spy. Another was a drunk. Soldiers began stealing food. There was talk of mutiny. By June 1699, only 7 months after arrival, the colony was broken. 400 settlers were dead. 1/3 of the expedition. The rest were walking skeletons. They had not traded a single cargo. They were eating boiled leather. They held a final council meeting. The decision was unanimous. Abandon. They dragged themselves onto the 4 remaining ships. They were so weak they couldn't weigh the anchors. They cut the cables and left the iron in the mud. On June 22, 1699, the fleet limped out of Caledonia Bay. They left behind empty huts and a graveyard. The voyage home was a horror. The ships were floating hospitals. They were battered by storms. The St. Andrew limped to Jamaica, but the English governor refused to let them by water. He obeyed the king's orders. He let them die in the harbor. The Unicorn sailed to New York, but was leaking so badly it was abandoned on the shore of New Jersey. Of the 1,200 Scots who left Leith with flags flying, fewer than 300 survived. Most were buried at sea, wrapped in the woolen blankets they had hoped to sell. But the tragedy wasn't just that it failed. It was that the disaster happened twice. While survivors were dying in the jungle, back in Edinburgh, the company directors were starved for news. They spun rumors into facts. They told the public the colony was thriving, that gold had been found. The stock price soared. Based on these lies, the directors organized a second expedition. They raised more money from the desperate population. In August 1699, 2 months after the first colony had been abandoned, the Second Fleet set sail. 4 ships, 1,300 new settlers, more wool, more Bibles, more combs. They sailed with high hearts, believing they were reinforcing a booming hub. They carried the last remaining capital of Scotland. They arrived in Caledonia Bay on November 30th, 1699. They sailed into the harbor, expecting smoke and bagpipes. Instead, they found silence. They rowed ashore and found a ghost town. The huts were burned. The fort was overgrown. Tools lay rusting. And everywhere there were graves. The shock was absolute. They realized the terrible truth. They had been sent to a graveyard. The money was gone. The dream was a lie. Some captains wanted to turn around immediately, but the winds were against them. They had barely enough food. They were trapped. Grimly, they decided to stay. They tried to rebuild, but the psychological weight crushed them. They could see skeletons in shallow graves, and this time Spain wasn't going to wait. The Spanish viceroy in Mexico City mobilized a fleet. He gathered an army. He was determined to wipe the Scots off the map. In February 1700, 3 months after the Second Fleet arrived, the Spanish Armada appeared. 11 warships. They blockaded the harbor. Simultaneously, a Spanish army marched through the jungle and surrounded the fort. The Scots were outnumbered and outgunned. Spanish cannons pounded the defenses. The wells ran dry. For a month, the Scots held out. They were fighting for a colony that was already dead, for a company that was already bankrupt. Finally, in March 1700, the Scottish commander surrendered. The Spanish general was surprisingly merciful. He admired their courage. He allowed them to leave with their flags flying, provided they swore never to return. The final evacuation began. The Scots boarded their ships. They sailed past the Spanish warships. They left behind the graves of 2,000 countrymen. They left behind the dream of a Scottish empire. The Spanish burned New Edinburgh to the ground. The jungle reclaimed the land. Within years there was no trace the Scots had ever been there. But the financial shock wave was just beginning. When news of the total collapse finally reached Edinburgh, the wailing could be heard in the streets. The nation woke up to a balance sheet bleeding red ink. The Company of Scotland was insolvent. The ships were lost. The cargo was lost. The capital was lost. There was no insurance. There was no backup plan. Scotland had bet the house, and the house had won. To understand the panic, you have to remember the scale. This wasn't a stock market crash where rich men lost surplus wealth. This was a national liquidation. Almost half the money in Scotland had been drained away. The immediate impact was a total freeze. There was no cash left in circulation. Merchants couldn't pay suppliers. Landowners couldn't pay debts. Tenants couldn't pay rent. The entire machinery of the Scottish economy ground to a halt. The Company of Scotland was now a rotting corpse. Its stock was worthless. Men who had been wealthy citizens suddenly found themselves destitute. Estates that had been in families for generations were put up for sale. But there were no buyers because there was no money. A deep depression settled over the land. The 7 ill years had weakened them physically. Darien broke them psychologically. Denial turned to rage. The Scottish people refused to believe the failure was their fault. They looked for a scapegoat. They found one in London. The anger was directed at King William and the English Parliament. The narrative was that Darien hadn't failed. It had been murdered, strangled by the English blockade, sabotaged by English spies, abandoned by a king who cared more for his English subjects. Riots broke out in Edinburgh. Mobs smashed windows. They burned effigies of English ministers. The mood was ugly and revolutionary.